Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Shannon's Lumber Industry Update, episode 150. Today, I'm talking about hickory. The true hickory, the one hickory to rule them all. And I say that because hickory is one of those conglomerate species, the Caria genus. Well, Caria ovata, Caria tomentosa, Caria lacinosa, however the heck we say that. There's a lot of different hickories, but then there's also pecan hickories. What the heck does that mean? We're going to talk about the true hickories, and we're going to feature hickory as our species of the month. So thank you for tuning into the show. I am your host, Shannon Rogers. I am happy to be here to wood nerd out on everything. I've got a lot of interesting topics this week, a couple of good questions, but certainly this is the last episode of the month, and I try to feature a specific species. So this month I'm featuring hickory because you know what? Next week, as I'm recording this, is the 4th of July. It's the birthday of America. So I've got a wonderful red, white, and blue theme on the sticker this month. Why? Because hickory built America. In fact, I remember a Woodwright Shop episode, season 30 something. It was entitled "Hooray for Hickory." And I remember watching that episode when it came out and thinking, yeah, heck yeah, Roy, hooray for hickory. Roy Underhill made the case that hickory allowed us to build America simply with the humble axe. Now, obviously this is a carving axe. My felling axe is out in the shed, but the handles that we make these out of, more importantly, here's a good vintage hewing axe with a hickory handle on it. Those axes created the American felling axe, which allowed literally building this country and westward expansion in this country. And the hickory that we have here in specifically the United States, it's not really found anywhere else. Hickory grows all across the world, but the specific hickory we have here in the US, well, it allows some pretty amazing tool handles. So we're going to feature it as we come upon our nation's birthday. Yeah, the national wood is oak. Literally, look up the national wood of the United States, and the answer is oak, or sometimes mighty oak. What the heck does that mean? We've talked enough about oak to know that oak could be any number of hundreds of species. And I think, frankly, in our current everybody gets a ribbon climate culture, they just decided to name oak. You know, nobody was able to step up and say, you know what, white oak or live oak or swamp oak. No, it was just oak. I find that to be a cop-out. So I'm going to get more specific and go with another conglomerate species and say hickory. But you know what? Shagbark hickory. Maybe shellbark hickory, maybe mockernut hickory. We're going to get to why this is kind of a confusing species. Spoiler alert, it doesn't have to be that confusing because a lot of them are pretty much all the same. But I did have some great feedback from the last episode. Actually, before I say that, let me stop and say I tried to get an episode out before I went out of town, and it just did not happen. By the time I got back and got kind of my wits about me again, I realized here we are in the last week of June. So yeah, unfortunately, there will only be one episode of the Lumber Update this particular month, which is why I wanted to get the featured species episode out. So sorry about that for everybody who was waiting for that. I'll get another episode into the mix sometime in the coming months. Don't worry. We'll have a little bonus episode when you least expect it. But I got some great feedback on Douglas fir. And actually, let me just go ahead and read the email because there's some really good stuff in it. It's funny. The one thing about Douglas fir, it's in the botanical name, Pseudotsuga menziesii. Well, Pseudotsuga, first of all, it's Douglas fir. Well, fir is in the Abies genus. Pseudotsuga, what the heck is that? In fact, Pseudotsuga means like fake cedar. Sugi in Japanese is Japanese cedar. Pseudotsuga and Sugi genus is the cedars, the true cedars, which, by the way, Western red cedar is also not a cedar, nor is Douglas fir a fir. It's actually not even a cedar. It's a fake cedar, a Pseudotsuga. And it was the one point that I was going to make, and I kind of didn't because I thought, you know what? Nobody's going to really care about that. Well, I was wrong. I got a great email from Patrick. He said, I'm a longtime listener and listening since episode 1. Love the podcast. Well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. I just listened to episode 149 on Douglas fir, and as always, it was a great episode, full of good information, but I thought I heard you say something that I know is wrong. And of course, I can't let that stand unremarked. This is why I love my listeners. I thought I heard you say that Douglas fir is a fir. Did you? Did I mishear? Maybe I did, but if I did, then others did as well, so it's still worth the message. Honestly, I don't know if I did or not. I can't believe I would, because I'm constantly making this point to people in my day job. Oh, fun fact, Douglas fir is not actually a fir. It's not in the AB's Genius. It's actually closer to a cedar, because I'm that kind of a nerd and I like to bore my customers with this. I think I specifically didn't say that because I just thought, you know what, there's so much about fir. But Patrick goes on to say some interesting things that I think I didn't make clear enough, and we need to make clear now, specifically about Douglas fir's life as a construction timber. So Douglas fir is not a fir, Patrick says. It's not even closely related. The F in SPF is never Douglas fir. Put a pin in that. Pseudotsuga minzizii, but rather one of the true firs of the Abies genus. So Patrick is right for the most part. When you're talking about construction lumber, SPF and hem fir, we are talking about northern whitewoods that are actual firs or sometimes spruces, firs primarily in the Abies genus. However, in certain parts of the country where Douglas fir grows everywhere, you will find that that particular Douglas fir is showing up in the SPF. Now, there are some other marking systems and grading systems, kind of like the southern yellow pines where we have PPs and LPs for lodgepole and ponderosa. You will find some fir marking systems, specifically in the Pacific Northwest and in British Columbia, where Douglas fir is called out DF specifically, as compared to just SPF. But you will find that Douglas fir is sneaking into the SPF in certain parts of the country where it grows everywhere. But if you also go to certain big box stores, I know Home Depot, for example, does carry Douglas fir 4x4s. They do not make a distinction. Well, that's not true. Some of them do, and they do have a DF stamp on them, but a lot of times the little label with the barcode on it on the rack is saying SPF 4x4. So big shock that Home Depot didn't properly label something, but yeah, so we can't make the absolute that Douglas fir is never found, but I will concede Patrick's point and say that Douglas fir is kind of, when used in construction, as a construction lumber, it is kind of an exception to the rule, and oftentimes a specialized construction lumber product, like a thicker cut, like a 4x4 or a 6x6 or something like that. So, it was an interesting point that whether I said it was a fir or not, I honestly don't know. I would be shocked myself if I did say that. That's just not in my character. But I really neglected to kind of make that point clear that Douglas fir is not, in fact, a fir. And I did make the point that it is the F and SPF. I think I said that a couple of times. And that's not entirely correct, except for small little enclaves. And you folks know who you are, and you probably bought the material. But fir, specifically the Abies genus, totally different wood. White wood, little to no grain contrast, much softer, 300, 400 Janka hardness, not nearly in the lengths and the widths that you can find in the majestic fir. So thank you, Patrick. As always, guys, I love it when you call me on my stuff. I often record these shows in one take just because I get excited and I just got to roll. Sometimes the stuff that comes out of my mouth, who knows? So definitely spot those errors and bring them up, because if there's something that I missed, we need to inform everyone else listening to this who's blindly accepting my word as gospel. Hopefully none of you are, because that would just be silly. Anyway, let's move on to some industry stuff here. One in particular that I find interesting is a bill that is currently in both the House and the Senate. In other words, it's a companion bill. So if you don't remember your, what was that, U.S. history or civics class? I never had civics. I had U.S. history. Or your Saturday afternoon School of Rock, how a bill becomes a law. A companion bill, by definition, is a bill that's introduced simultaneously into the House and to the Senate as an effort to kind of speed it along, instead of it going to the House and getting approved and then going to the Senate, or vice versa, and getting approved individually. You approve them both at the same time. So essentially, the bill is slightly different, but for the most part, it's the same bill. This is the one that's in the House right now, H.R. 3322, the Solid American Hardwood Tax Credit Act. This is particularly interesting. This goes along with so much of what we've been talking about in the political realm of using more woods grown locally, more domestic species. Now, Alabama and Mississippi, and then the companion bill, I think, is Missouri and Tennessee representatives I'm talking about. I could be totally wrong on this, but for the most part, southern states that have southern yellow pine in their districts are proposing that if we Americans put an American-grown, a domestic species, now this is the Hardwood Tax Credit Act. The bill that I've read through doesn't actually make a clear distinction between hardwood and softwood, and I wonder if that's going to become a bone of contention later on. But what they're saying is domestic hardwoods that are installed in your house are eligible for a tax credit. So if I put in oak hardwood floors in my house, if I put up a feature wall with maple, I could get a tax credit, a below-the-line tax credit, not a tax deduction. It's a big deal, folks, because I personally have done a lot of this in the last year. Now, if this gets passed, who knows if it's going to grandfather? Probably not. But, a lot of us, especially the woodworkers like myself who are listening to this or watching this on YouTube, we're putting hardwoods in our house all the time. Now, there's certainly going to be a long list of it depends that's going to come out of this bill. What will actually qualify? If I build a piece of furniture out of Appalachian cherry, is that going to qualify? Probably not. If I side my house in a solid wood product, if it's domestic, yeah, I would think you would. If you put your deck down and use a domestic species, hell yes, I think that would qualify. So this is particularly interesting. So right now, it's in front of both houses. It's been introduced, and this is straight off of, what is this website? Like something.gov, senate.gov or bill.gov, who knows what it is. It was introduced, I think, back in late May, and then it kind of languished around for a while. This is the pace of our government, folks. The companion bill was introduced, I think, the first week of June. So it's early on, but there is a lot of groundswell of support for this. It's kind of a no-brainer in many instances, which means who knows what's going to happen, right? No-brainer legislation. It might not get passed. Go figure. But I'm particularly interested in this because certainly at my day job, we've been looking at a lot more domestics. We have a lot of exotics in our inventory, and we're trying to find a lot more domestics that can kind of work into the design idiom of so many architects and designers who are specifying solid woods. I will be really curious to find out how this plays out as far as the hardwood softwood distinction. I wouldn't be surprised if, now the folks that were presenting this, I said they have southern yellow pine in their districts, but they also have a lot of oak, southern red oak, white oak, cherry, maple, walnut. I know the Missouri congressman that proposed this, he's talking oak and walnut in his district. But most of these folks have southern yellow pine forests in their districts. And southern yellow pine is a great flooring product. And the more things that are done with southern yellow pine, like there are a lot of companies in the US now thermally modifying southern yellow pine, that could be a game changer as far as its usage, where you would traditionally use a harder wood or a more stable wood. So I do believe this bill could be a bit short-sighted just by saying hardwood. You and I all know how our government works, right? Somebody proposed this bill, maybe threw a little bit of campaign funding to that customer. And no, basically all we have to do is get Weyerhaeuser to step up, and this will suddenly be both hardwood and softwood. We'll see. Sorry to blight Weyerhaeuser. I don't mean to do that. But yeah, interesting to see this develop. I'm going to be following this closely because obviously it will impact me at my day job pretty readily, but it will impact me as a U.S. citizen and as a homeowner in using hardwood species, domestic species, in my own house. So stay tuned for that. Now, here's another one. This is Inventwood. I have gotten so many emails from people over the last month about Inventwood, specifically their product Superwood. Now, if you haven't heard of this, if you've been listening to this show, you have heard of it, because I've been featuring this product probably 4 separate times since the beginning of this show back when it was just an experiment at the University of Maryland at College Park. When I talk about transparent wood and making wood for like wooden windows, that's coming out of this study. When I've talked about densified wood, when I talked about some of the wood that they were experimenting for the Lignosat, wooden satellite, that was coming out of this study. Basically, this is a professor and his research group at the University of Maryland has now founded a company. They got some funding. They have started a facility in Frederick, Maryland. In fact, I actually featured that story a couple of years ago when they said they would be locating in Frederick, Maryland. They have built their manufacturing facility in Frederick, Maryland, right out by USAMRID, where they're probably still studying COVID, and are going to begin releasing their first product, their interior superwood product, any day now. They're saying summer of 2025, and then their exterior product in the fall of 25. This is a densified wood product. So the glass, the transparent wood, it started by removing the lignin. Inventwood is following that same principle, and there's a lot of patents coming out of this and a lot of different material science applications coming out of just this simple process of removing the lignin. Now, the lignin is removed when you're making pulp to make paper. So they use a sodium hydroxide product to do that. Very similar process, but what's left is just cellulose and maybe a little bit of hemicellulose, but they're really ending up with cellulose, which, as we've talked about any number of times, like in the cellular makeup of trees episode, it is the strong stuff in wood. It's the long fibers that make up wood. Once you remove the lignin, there's a lot of dead space left in there. So they then compress those cellulose fibers. Instead of it being cellulose fibers with a bunch of little, air pockets in between it, they compress it down so it's just packed on top of one another. And in many instances, there's some videos that I've seen where you take like a block of wood that's like 3 inches thick and now it's a 1/4 inch thick. There's that much compression. This is not the same compression we talked about when we did a compressed wood episode. That's compressing longitudinally, shortening the length. This is compressing in all directions at once to remove all that dead space. And it creates a species that is stronger and lighter than steel. Now, there are so many questions on this, and this is a company that was featured best in show at the International Builder Show this year in 2025. It's been written up any number of times in all kinds of tech podcasts. It's so many articles about this, but really there's not that much information about it. What I just told you about the process is about all you're going to be able to glean from reading the research papers that have been coming out since I think 2016. I've read all those papers. As I said, I've been reporting on this in almost real time since this show started. But here's the thing. How does it cut? Like, if it's stronger than steel, can you draw fasteners into it? Or is it like steel and you have to use specialized tooling and specialized fasteners? So let's talk a little bit about the technical properties, because they have released some spec guides on this. And I'm going to be talking about hickory here in a little bit. I consider hickory to be the strongest North American wood. So bending strength and stiffness, modulus of elasticity, modulus of rupture. Those two numbers often characterize how strong a wood is. Density plays in there as well. But hickory, for example, has an MOE of 20,000-ish pounds per square inch, as an MOR of 2.1 to 2.2 million. I got it right in front of me here. 2.2 million. It's high. It's really high, really, really high. So let's look at that, 20,000 and 2.1 million. Just remember those numbers. And let's compare it to superwood. MOE of hickory, 20,000. Inventwood, 35,000. MOR of hickory, 2.1 million. Inventwood, 4.6 million pounds per square inch. That's ridiculous. It is stronger than steel and it is lighter than steel. I don't have the weight numbers in front of me at this point because, again, this product is not on the market yet. There's a lot of interesting, a lot of questions, basically more questions that I have answers. So here's why I'm bringing this up, because so many of you have written in and said, ooh, Maybe you should feature this on the show, or what do you know about this? I've responded to every single one of you that have sent this in and said, I am trying to get these folks on the show. I have been emailing them for months. I talked to somebody at IBS who was basically a marketing person and said, we need to talk. I've been emailing them on behalf of J. Gibson McIlvaine saying, hey, we'd be interested in becoming a distributor. We're right here in Maryland, so are you. It's kind of a no-brainer. I've been trying to get someone on the horn. And it's interesting because I've talked to a lot of my contemporaries. I've looked at comments on YouTube videos, and a lot of people are getting the same kind of brick wall. I get the feeling they're not ready to talk about this yet. More than likely, they're still figuring out all the eccentricities and the problems and fixing the bugs of scaling up production. They're supposedly going to have a 1 million square foot per annum capacity when they launch, with the idea of moving to 30 million square feet per annum capacity. It's not huge, in other words, and this is going to be a premium specialty product, but I want to get these folks on the show and talk about this and talk the technical details. So I've reached out to them a number of times. I finally got word back from them a couple of weeks ago saying we'll take it under advisement. So what I need you, loyal listeners, to do is go to inventwood.com. Click on the Contact Us button. You'll see it up there in the upper right if you're watching the video. Send them an email and say, go on Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. This is a podcast you want to be featured on from a technical perspective. There's been some videos, there's been some articles, and it's all very fluffy. But let's talk about what we, the woodworkers and the industry, the builders, the architects, want to know about this product. I got a whole suite of questions that if I were to pitch this to an architect, they would be into it, but they would immediately ask me these 20 questions. We need to have this conversation in Inventwood, and I'm telling you this right now, and I'm hopeful that everybody listening to this is going to go to Inventwood. Let's crowdsource this, folks. If we can get a bunch of you writing in saying going on this podcast, maybe they'll respond to me and they'll come on the show, because I'm fascinated to talk to them about this product. They are a local company here in Maryland. I would love to go to their factory and check it out. I would love to just get my questions answered, because I can guarantee you I've got customers who are going to want to use this, but they're not going to touch it unless they can get some of these questions answered about its workability, about all of those technical things, and actually putting this into application. If all they're going to do is go to market as like a cladding board or a decking board, well, even then I have questions. Like if we don't have to transform it or change the shape or do any woodworking, we must have to cut it to length. Can I cut it with a saw? Do I have to use a carbide blade? Probably. How do I fasten it? Do I use decking screws? Is there a separate line of decking screws? Like this is the stuff that comes up even if we don't have to transform it. But for what this wood can do as a Class A fire-rated, essentially waterproof, stronger than steel, lighter than steel, durable product, well, I'm going to probably want to use it for flooring. I'm going to want to use it for decking. I'm going to want to use it for cladding. All of that is going to require woodworking, molding into a Dutch slap siding pattern or a nickel gap or a tongue and groove or something like that. These are questions we need to know. So Inventwood, if you're listening to this, I'm the guy who's been hammering on you for the last probably 2 years, because I learned about this at IBS 2 years ago. Come on the show, let's sit down and let's talk about it. And listeners, please, I would love your help in encouraging them. So I don't ask for much. I ask you to listen from time to time. Sometimes I say, hey, become a patron, support the show. If you want to support the show and you don't want to give them any money, that's cool. Write Inventwood and tell them they should come on Shannon's Lumber Industry Update podcast, because I think it would be a really good conversation for the industry to hear and should help jumpstart their business. Enough of that. Let's move on. Let's talk hickory, shall we? Hickory. It's a great American wood. To quote Roy Underhill, we named a president after it. Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. They named it Old Hickory because he was tough. We would say today, tough as nails. Tough as Old Hickory. That's what they said, which ironically, Roy was quick to make this point. I was happy to think that I came up with this point first, and then I watched this episode again very, very recently, and Roy came up with it first, so I have to throw it to him. Old Hickory is actually not that strong. Old Hickory is quite brash. What you want is young hickory. We've talked about this before. Hardwoods, slower grown, denser packed growth rings in hardwoods are actually weaker than faster grown, wider space growth rings in hardwoods, and hickory is no exception to that. So hickory, what does it look like, first of all? Well, probably you've seen it. It is a kind of brownish wood with a white, creamy sapwood. It tends to have a lot of knots. It tends to have kind of a wild, squirrely grain. Anybody who's worked with it has probably kind of grumbled under the breath and said the stuff tears out and it's hard as a rock. Yeah, it's about 1800 Janko hardness, sometimes up to 2100 Janko hardness, depending upon the species that you're going to run into. So what are we talking about? Well, Caria SPP is what I put on my label here, because that's kind of the way of saying Caria variety of species. You'll find a lot of conglomerate species. Kaya, African mahogany, you'll often see listed as Kaya SPP. Caria ovata is, that's shagbark hickory, I think. I'm getting them mixed up in my head. Yeah, Caria ovata, shagbark hickory. Caria lacinosa is shellbark hickory. Caria glabra is pignut hickory. Caria tomentosa is mockernut hickory. Those are kind of the primary species that you're going to run into with hickory. Not the pecan hickories, but the true hickories. There are more, but when you're going to a lumber yard and you're buying hickory, it's probably going to be shellbark, shagbark, mockernut, or pignut. I would probably say shagbark and mockernut would be the top two, like most common, but it kind of depends upon where you're buying it regionally. Some lumber yards will actually sell pecan or pecan hickory at the same time. The good lumber yards, who are basically close to the sources in kind of central and southeastern United States, they're probably going to have both in great quantities. Pecan is actually, it's the state tree of Texas, I believe. And is also closely related, well, not closely related, it is related to mesquite. So you will hear mesquite hickory thrown around. You'll even hear pecan mesquite thrown around. What's the difference? Well, let's talk about that first. The difference is not a whole lot, really. The pecan hickories generally have a lower density. They might be a little bit softer. They might be a little bit weaker. In other words, the bending strength is not going to be as high. The stiffness is not going to be as high. They're going to be a little bit more brash. They're going to grow a little bit more like nutwoods and fruitwoods. So while their density is a little bit lower, you might find their grain a little bit closer packed. They do have big pores, though, which is what keeps the density from getting too high on those. I shouldn't say it's still pretty high, but not as high as the true hickories. Workability-wise, I actually find pecans to be harder to work with than hickory. Maybe it's because I'm expecting true hickories to just be a real pain in the you-know-what. And I go into pecan thinking, oh, this will be easier, and then I'm horribly disappointed. I find that pecan is squirrelier from a grain perspective, tears out a lot more. And that's pretty typical of the trees that we would normally see cultivated for their fruits. Pecans, obviously, come from the pecan. So it's not really sold as a lumber tree. It's pruned to produce more fruit. So they're smaller trees. They're what's the word I'm looking for? Grove type trees. And going to branch a lot more often, going to have a lot more knots, going to have a little bit more twisty grain. The true hickory, well, that's a forest tree. It can grow up to about 100 feet, but only about 2 feet wide. So what I have pictured, this full like double live edge slab, is very typical of a mature hickory tree. You're lucky if you can get a 12-inch board out of it. If you do a slab, you might get lucky and get a full 24 inches, but that is a fully mature hickory tree. I think you'll find that a lot of the hickory trees are going to be felled in the 18 to 20 inch diameter range. I don't know what the diameter breast height for the hickory is, but it's probably in that 18 to 20 inch range. 24 is going to be rarer because that really is at the max of the tree itself. It's going to have this kind of brown, Enderton, creamy outer sapwood to it. But what you're also going to find is just a lot of narrow boards. You know, a full slab, yeah, you might be able to see the full width of the tree, but when you're cutting boards, when you're not shooting for slabs, you're going to end up with, at most, probably 6-inch boards. They're going to pull a board from either side of the pith, and you're going to end up with 6-inch boards. I've seen some 8-inch wide hickory, but it's awful close to the pith, and you find that there can be some squirrely stuff right there in close to the pith. A lot of sapwood in the hickory. The image that I'm showing for those watching the video is typical of what you would find in hickory. Lots of sapwood. In other words, kind of this calico look to it. In fact, calico hickory is a brand or a type of hickory, it basically just means hickory with a lot of sapwood. If that's not marketing spin, I don't know what it is. It's calico. It doesn't have a lot of sapwood. But in use, you probably have all seen a hickory kitchen. It has a very distinct kind of rustic feel to it, showing an image of a hickory kitchen. A lot of sapwood integrated into the designs simply because it's hard to get all heart boards. You'll end up with little sticks if you're doing that. Occasionally you might get a rail or a stile that's all heart, but you're still going to find little bits of sap working its way into it. The real prime market for hickory is in flooring. And it's that same kind of rustic vibe. It's this kind of patchwork look where you've got a deeper brown board, then you've got a totally creamy white board, and you've got a board that's kind of somewhere in the middle. That's what you can expect with hickory. Some of that is because there's a lot of different species present when we're talking hickory, but some of that is just the nature of the tree itself. If I pull this slab image back up on here, this is a pretty consistently colored slab, but you can see wide bands of creamy sapwood on either side of it. But even the heartwood has a lot of kind of graininess going on with it. When I pull up the image of these are probably, I would say, 4-inch boards, the amount of sap present in this tree, and you think about it, if you get 2 boards right close to the pith, flanking the pith in the center of the tree, you might get heartwood with a line of sap right at the edge. But as you move further out from the tree, you have to think 3-dimensionally. Remember, the tree is round. As you're moving further out, you're going to find sap, like entirely one face full of sap, and the other face may have this little island of heartwood visible in it, surrounded by a bunch of sap. That's extraordinarily common. And the fact that we just can't get a lot of all heart boards, if you went to a lumberyard and said, I want all heart hickory, they would laugh at you. But that is why we end up with floors and kitchens that have that kind of patchwork, kind of rustic feel to it. So right off the bat, where is hickory going to be used from a design perspective? Probably in more rustic designs. You're not going to find it really in your contemporary things. That's fine. I'm okay with that. Hickory has its own feel, kind of like red oak, kind of like white oak is now moving to a more contemporary feel with the rift side of things. So let's talk numbers. I've already said hardness. It's pretty hard, right? It is 1860 to around 2100, although I've seen some numbers in the 2200s before. Identifying the different hickory species is next to impossible. Don't bother. Their working properties, even a lot of places will cite different numbers, but even then they'll put an asterisk next to it and say this is an estimated number based upon density. Even the Wood Database does that. It's best to just think of them all as one species. When you are trying to distinguish between the pecan hickories and the true hickories, that's actually pretty easy to do because the pecan hickories, well, true hickory is definitely a ring porous tree. It's got big, huge pores. Often you'll find some tylose present in there, whereas pecan hickories tend to be more semi-ring porous. You got that kind of smaller pores spreading in kind of not definite defined rings. A true hickory is going to have huge pores in the early wood and smaller, I would say medium pores in the late wood. But you're going to find parenchyma around the pores only in late wood for true hickory. In pecan hickories, you're going to find parenchyma, reticulate parenchyma, specifically around all the pores in both early wood and late wood. So that actually makes them pretty easy to tell them apart between the pecans and the true hickories. Not a whole lot of medullary ray going on, very narrow rays, but they're also very closely spaced. If you've ever seen the ray fleck in cherry or maple, that's going to be similar to what you're going to find in hickory. But here's the fun part. Hickory, like, this is a strength game, ultimately. And the strength story, it's extremely dense. 0.64 and 50 pounds per cubic foot. So let's just contrast that. Walnut, kind of a medium hardwood, right? 0.5 density compared to 0.64 for hickory, and 38 pounds per cubic foot. So 50 versus 38 pounds per cubic foot. And we think of walnut is a solid hardwood. So let's compare it to something harder like white oak. Well, white oak, Okay, 0.6 versus 0.65. That's a big deal when you're talking wood density, because wood density is generally measured in like a 0.2 range. So 0.05, that's kind of a big deal. And we think of white oak as being very dense and very heavy. 47 pounds per cubic foot, and hickory is still coming in heavier than that at 50 pounds. So a 3 pound per cubic foot difference between hickory and white oak. And white oak and red oak, the number is going to be a little bit lower than that. But oak is often, it's the U.S. national tree. It's the mighty oak. It's strong. Hickory puts it to shame. And the real numbers come down to its stiffness and its bending strength, modulus of elasticity, and modulus of rupture. Modulus of rupture, or its stiffness, is 20,200 pounds per square inch. Most of the hard, strong, air quotes, hardwoods in North America are going to be around 14,000 or 12,000. 20,000 is what hickory is. Modulus of elasticity, or the bending strength, is 2.16 million. Again, 1.7, 1.5 was what you're going to find for most of the harder, denser North American species. Certainly, you're going to find tropical woods that are going to have higher MOE and MORs, but there is only one that I know of, only one species of ring porous wood with big pores that touches those numbers. In fact, let's find out. Let's go to the wood database in real time here. And let's see into the wood filter. So if you're not familiar with this wood filter, it's a lovely tool. Thank you, Eric, for building this. I'm going to go down to advanced hardwood ID features, and I'm going to select ring porous. I'm going to then go up to the little sliders for modulus of elasticity. And let's just slide that up to 2 million, 1.8, 1.9. It's kind of a hair trigger on this slider. Let's go to, we'll stick it with 1.6 because I don't want to mess around with it. And let's go to modulus of rupture and move that up to, say, 19,000. And it filters to shagbark hickory and black locust. Okay, black locust. So let's get more specific. Let's move the modulus of rupture of elasticity up to 2 million from 1.96, wherever it was. Okay, black locust is still there, so maybe I stand corrected at this point. Let's move the modulus of rupture up to 20,000. And you'll notice the top end of the modulus of rupture number is 20,200. Guess what? That's where hickory is. If I move the modulus of rupture up to 19,740, hickory stands alone, folks. Now, this is the wood database. It's pretty exhaustive. It doesn't have every wood in there, but that makes hickory stand all by itself. If I were to go back to the hardwood ID features and remove the ring porous filter, I'm going to get more results. Certainly, I've got, pignut hickory shows up because pignut hickory, again, they're going to classify that as more semi-ring porous. Padauk shows up in here. Palm, okay, that's kind of cheating. And pink ivory. That's it, folks. Those are the only species that are going to show up with that combination of strength numbers. I don't think I can overstate how important that is. Well, I can explain it a little bit more. So the high stiffness, well, that's pretty simple, right? You can try to bend it and it's not going to bend. You can extend that between two joists on a deck and you can bounce up and down in the middle of that board and it's not going to deflect without a hell of a lot of force. The bending strength, however, it's got a high bending strength, which means you can bend it a lot before it actually breaks. But it's also super stiff, so it takes a hell of a lot of force to actually bend it. Well, with a lot of force required to bend it means a lot of force to bend it back, to flex it back, that elasticity. That's why it's modulus of elasticity. So when I have something that can be bent a heck of a lot without breaking, but requires a hell of a lot of strength to actually bend it, what happens is I've got a super rigid, strong, stiff handle that can swing a heavy 3-pound American felling axe head. But as you're swinging it and you're accelerating it through that arc, it is going to flex a little, but then it's going to straighten up with great force. It's going to add a little spring, a little snap, a little kick at the end of that axe stroke that will allow us to fell trees with a standard 3-pound American felling axe head. Compare that to European axes. Credit goes to Roy Underhill for this little point. This was in his episode. And I never thought about this before, but European felling axes are much bigger, longer bladed things. They rely upon the weight of the axe head to actually dig into the wood because they're using ash. Ash doesn't even come close to these numbers. The Europeans didn't have the hickory. Their hickory died off during the last ice age. Roy's got a really good story about that because their mountains run east-west and our mountains run north-south. So our trees were able to seed ahead of the descending glaciers by moving further south. In Europe, they could only move up mountainsides and they got high enough that they died due to the cold. So European axes rely upon the weight of that head to do their job, whereas American felling axes can get by with a much, 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 much lighter head. We can accelerate that head faster and get an even faster acceleration when we decelerate, when we stop, and it springs forward. For this reason, axe handles, tool handles, hammer handles, this is what hickory is primarily used for. You'll find it in ladders from time to time. That's more of a static, being able to stand that, or not being able to deflect as you're standing on the rung. Baseball bats. Go back to Babe Ruth, and he was using a hickory baseball bat for the same reason. As you swing through that bat swing, and when it hits the ball, you get that little kick, that little spring at the end that's going to launch that ball over the green monster. This is what truly sets hickory apart. And we talk about bending strength, and we often bowwood or Osage orange comes up. Well, what makes Osage orange good at being a bow is that it's got a lower bending strength, but a high stiffness. So it springs back with great force due to the high stiffness, but with the lower bending strength, I can bend it a little bit easier. In other words, with human pressure, I can bend that. If the bow were super hard to bend, you never get a shot off. That's what makes Osage orange, Bois d'Arc, our bowwood, because of that contrast between lower bending and higher stiffness. Hickory has high stiffness and high bending strength, making it incredibly shock resistant, which is why hickory shows up a lot in floor. That's a static application, but walk across a hickory floor in like hard-heeled shoes or high-heeled shoes, it will not dent the stuff. Also, if you use it on a joist application, not laid on a subfloor, it's not going to bounce. It's not going to deflect on you as well. It is a brilliant wood from a stiffness perspective. When you rive the stuff, I've got a piece of riven hickory right here in my shop. This is what's left over from the piece of hickory that I made my spring pole lathe out of. I wanted a long pole that would flex, but that would bounce back just as quickly to provide that reciprocal action for my spring pole lathe. Hickory is what I chose for that. And I took a blank of hickory and I rove it. I have riven it. What's the past participle of to rive? I don't know. I split it. That's what it is. I split it along the grain, which gave me even stronger hickory, because now I've got a continuous growth ring here. And you can see, if you're looking at the video, kind of the curviness of this particular piece of hickory because it split with the grain. Hickory's got a squirrely grain. It's nothing straight grained about it, but it is immensely strong. If you can get hickory and use it for chairs, it's fantastic. And from a furniture perspective, you will still find hickory being used in a commercial basis all the time. It is a fantastic wood. It doesn't get nearly the press that I think it should, and I think a lot of that is that somewhat rustic nature that is allowed it to kind of fall out of the design idiom. It is hard to work with. It does tear out pretty readily. Certainly working with it green is going to make things a lot easier. That's how I worked with that piece that I was just showing for my spring pole lathe. But speaking of working with it green, one of the other uses of it is the bark. Peeling the bark off to weave chair seats, or peeling the bark off whole instead of in strips, and you can actually make rain gutters out of it. You look at a lot of old log cabins or moonshine stills back in the woods, not that I know anything about that, and you'll find these bark gutters that are funneling rain into a cistern. That's hickory bark that's been peeled off. Now, peeling bark is a springtime thing. When the sap is rising, you've got this very slick between the cambium layers, and you can peel the bark off. Or you can slice it with a knife and just peel it like peeling a banana, dry that, and weave it into chair seats. Incredibly strong. As it dries, it shrinks and it pulls the entire frame of the chair together. And it's not, I can't even really call that traditional. Chairs are still made this way through certain parts of the country. Handmade chairs are still very much made that way. So yeah, it's a fascinating species. It's a shame that it kind of ends up just as flooring today. It could have so many more purposes. The tree grows a lot of places. Anywhere where oak grows, you're going to find hickory, and you're going to find pretty even balances of oak and hickory. So it's around, but I think due to the less than clear nature and the smaller cutting size of it, it's been relegated to the flooring trade, where number 2 common, number 3 common is perfectly acceptable. It's very difficult to get FAS hickory because of its propensity for knots. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it. If you're looking for alternatives, you want to look at ring porous woods in general. I mean, ash could be an alternative. It's certainly going to be much whiter than hickory and much clearer than hickory, but it's close. Oak, certainly look for knottier oak. Red oak or white oak would be an alternative. Sassafras could be an interesting one, a little bit browner, but similar kind of squirrely grain. Catalpa is another one, a little bit more olive and brown than hickory, but and definitely not the sapwood that you're going to find in hickory as well, because all of those trees are much, much larger. They're going to have sapwood, but because the log itself is larger, you're actually going to be able to find some all heart boards. But I do think acceptable alternatives. The good news is hickory is available enough. You shouldn't have to dig too far to find it. So if you haven't worked with it before, I highly advise you go check out hickory and integrate it into your next project. Now, that sticker that I've been flashing up on the screen, that is the sticker that I'll be mailing out to my Patreon supporters. So here's my little plug for that. If you want to sponsor the show, go to patreon.com/lumberupdate. For my walnut tier subscribers, you get the species stickers sent off to you every single month. But, you know, while you're over there, take some time to what's the word I'm looking for? Sponsor the show by asking a question. It's not a word that I was really looking for, but take some time to ask a question. The show is fueled by questions. Go to lumberupdate.com, fill out the form to contact me there, or just email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. And if you're somebody working for Inventwood listening to this right now, email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. I want to talk to you. But let's talk questions, because I've had some great people, both Patreon sponsors and non-Patreon sponsors, who've asked me some questions, and I want to get into them. So Steve wrote me. He's got bugs in his ash tree. He's got a friend who has bugs. I have a friend that has about 12 to 14 very large ash trees on his property, all standing dead from the emerald ash borer. Can these trees be safely felled and still sawn into lumber, or should they be felled and burned? Please don't fell and burn them. Well, fell them, but don't burn them. This is a big mistake. A lot of people find ash borer dead trees, and think, oh, we got to burn them right away. And if you listen to my episode on the emerald ash borer, I don't remember what episode that was. Just go to lumberupdate.com and type ash borer into the search bar, and you'll find it. I think it's 38, or maybe it's 138. No, it can't be 138. Whatever. I had an entomologist on the show to talk about the emerald ash borer, and primarily the ash borer is going to be in the bark. It's not going to really be in the heartwood, but it might be in the heartwood. But here's the thing. The tried and true way to get rid of bugs in a tree is to kiln dry that wood. So yeah, you can burn the tree, but the wood is still fine. You know, even if that tree is dead, the galleries from the bugs are going to be primarily in the sapwood. There's going to be a lot of usable hardwood in that ash tree. So please don't cut it down and just mulch it. Well, definitely don't mulch it, because that could spread the bug around more. If you mulched it and piled it up in a pile, then endothermic heat buildup might kill those bugs, but it might not. Ultimately, what you want to do is fell that tree, saw it into boards, and quickly get those boards into a kiln. That will kill those bugs and you're going to have a lot of very usable lumber. There's too many ash trees being taken down and being burned or being mulched because they feel like it's bad and it's going to continue to spread things. Well, that's true. If you fell the tree and you just leave it sitting around, there's a possibility that those bugs could spread. But the reality is they're going to continue feeding on that tree, whether it's standing or lying on the ground. So the best thing to do is to fell it, saw it into boards, and put them in a kiln and dry them. So by all means, please take those trees down and please saw them in the lumber, but get them in a kiln quickly. Don't just leave them around for the bugs to continue to eat and destroy those boards. Yeah, that's not good. Now you're just wasting lumber and you might as well just burn it at that point. So yeah, get them in a kiln, dry them out. Good question, Steve. Thank you for asking that. Too many ash trees being wasted around here. John writes in. He says, I'm working on a Nara live edge table that my father-in-law brought home from the Philippines 55 plus years ago. Over the years, this table's been brought back and forth from the Philippines and has a few issues. First being that it's warped, and the second is the fact that it has a major check. I'm in the process of refinishing the table, and I'm applying a tabletop epoxy. Have you ever used epoxy on Nara? I ask as I've had a few issues with epoxy not curing properly. It seems that even after the cure time, 5 to 7 days, when I sand the epoxy, it gums up 220 grit sandpaper. I'm pretty sure the epoxy's been mixed properly as I use the 2-cup method and mix the batch per manufacturer directions. Do you know of any issues that Nara wood has with epoxy? So I recently featured Nara as a featured species, and I'm pretty sure that's when John sent this in. But you know, the most common thing I find with epoxy gumming up that way is it is improperly mixed. So John says that he was certain that he mixed it properly. We're going to go with that. But for those of you who aren't John, make sure you've mixed this properly. Make sure you've got the amount of resin and hardener equal and you mixed it a long time. A lot of these epoxies, as you mix them, they get cloudy, and then you want to keep mixing until it goes clear again. So it's going to get cloudy, keep mixing. It can take a little while before it goes clear again. You really don't want to apply it while it's still cloudy. Now, obviously, this is going to vary dependent upon the cure time of the epoxy. 5-minute epoxy is going to be different. You don't want to keep stirring that. That's obviously going to cure on you quickly. But the long set stuff, you really want to make sure that is stirred a long time. It should be almost crystal clear before you apply it. So make sure of that, John. The epoxy could be expired. That's the other thing that comes up. It was mixed properly, but it's never going to cure because that epoxy has expired. Nara, I doubt that the Nara is really going to cause any particular issues. But Nara, like a lot of these dense tropical woods, is quite oily. There are a lot of resins and extractives in the wood that could potentially interfere with glue or could interfere with finish. So I never say this of one particular species, oh, you must do this to Ipe, or you must do this with teak. I say it kind of as a general blanket statement about oily tropical woods. If the wood, when you touch it, feels kind of waxy or your fingers come away feeling oily, it's a good idea to wipe that board down with a solvent like mineral spirits. I like naphtha because it flashes off a little bit faster. Wipe it down with naphtha, let that flash off, and then immediately glue that up. It's possible that you could have hit a particularly oily section of that Nara, and it could have conflicted with that. That's not going to be a Nara thing. That's going to be a tropical oily wood thing. So wipe that down, clear those solvents, clear those oils off with a solvent. Let the solvent flash off. That's why, again, I like naphtha because you wait like 30 seconds and it's gone, and then immediately glue it up. The only other thing that could be a potential issue is the environment in which you glued it up. What kind of temperature and humidity fluctuation, or just what was the ambient temperature and humidity. But I think the bigger issue is any fluctuation that may have occurred. So if it was really humid, or maybe it was just, unclimate controlled and a storm blew through while that was curing, that can delay the cure time substantially. So that's kind of the stuff off the top of my head. Again, it's not specific to Nara. It's more specific to how epoxy works. Resorcinol-based glues, and tropical woods in general. I would say the same thing if you came to me saying Paduke, or snakewood, or sneezewood. That's a real wood, by the way. Moving on. Great question coming in from Kyle, mainly because Kyle has demonstrated that he is a loyal Lumber Update listener and actually practices what I preach all the time. So he says, I wanted to share how I've used what you taught me about wood properties. My brother-in-law recently traveled to Japan, and while there, he stopped at Inoue Hamono and bought a Geno, which I didn't know this, folks. A Geno is a type of hammer. I immediately thought of a chisel. I thought it was a brand, like a maker of chisel. It's actually a hammerhead. It comes unhandled, and you make your own handle for it. He mentioned that he'll need to do some wood species research, since the woods they traditionally use for this in Japan aren't commercially available in the States. We'll get to that in a little second. So he said, my first thoughts were hickory and ash. Hey, there's some theme to this. Hickory would be great for this. That's an easy answer. Since I know hickory is traditional tool handles domestically because of its springiness, it imparts to the wood. I decided to do some digging, however, and apparently the traditional woods for Geno handles are soraki and ushikoroshi. Horribly butchering that, I'm sure. Neither of which appear in the wood database, but I found a site that mentioned persimmon as a good option. Hey, a former featured wood species on their lumber update. As well as a smattering of other common woods, mostly domestics. Hickory, in addition to being hard, has a wildly hard MOR, 20,000, and an MOE of 2.1, which I believe account for much of why it makes a good tool handles. Good for you. See, you haven't listened to this episode because I'm recording it right now. That's awesome. Way to go into the wood database and look at those numbers. I went to the search function of the wood database, that filter that I just showed, and I filtered for commercially available woods sorted by MOE. After checking hickory's numbers, I went to the wood database filter, narrowed in on commercially available woods sorted by MOR and MOE, browsed down the lists. Red ash, Osage orange, and black locust looked to me like they would be viable domestic options. But going into the tropicals, it looks like greenheart and ipe might be the kings of this, assuming you can actually cut and shape them, hard as they are. So, this is excellent. This is applied lumber update knowledge. You went and you looked at the species you thought might be good. He looked up hickory. He saw the MOE and MOR numbers. He went to the wood filter. He looked for other species with similar numbers. He uncovered some that make a lot of sense. He listed several, and I will say, here's the next level. So, well done, Kyle. You have passed level 1, probably level 2. Let's take it up a notch. Let's go to level 3. So, you found, let's go back to the domestics. He filtered by the MOR, MOE numbers, looking for commercially available woods. That is a checkbox, by the way. You can check only commercially available woods. That keeps the sneeze woods and the snake woods out of the mix there. It found red ash, Osage orange, and black locust. Well, you just remember in my search earlier, black locust was staying next to hickory until I really moved the MOE up to 20,000. So I think black locust would be a good secondary option. Hickory's going to trump everything. Black locust would be a good secondary option for you. Osage orange. Well, what did I just say about Osage? High MOE, lower MOR. So if I've got a hammer, I'm going to flip my axe around and pretend it's a hammer. If I've got a hammer and I'm pounding and I've got an easier to flex handle, that could be a problem. It might feel a little bit springy. It might spill some of that energy that I'm driving that hammerhead off into space as the handle flexes. So I would say Osage is not a good option. You filtered by the MOE and found a high number, but you need to cross-reference that with the ratio to MOR. In this case, not so much. Great bow wood, probably not a good dynamic tool handle. It might make a good static tool handle, like a chisel handle, where I'm just tapping on the handle, and all I really care about there is impact resistance, density, MOE, hardness. Now I'm swinging that handle through an arc. That changes the story, and a bow wood, like Osage, is not going to be the best solution for you. Red ash, you're going to find, yeah, it might be okay, but those numbers are just substantially lower across the board from a density perspective. You're also going to have a smaller pore structure. So now we're moving to level 4. Hickory is as good as it is because it's got large pores. It's got some ability to resist impact because there is some dead air to absorb that impact as it happens. It allows that larger pore structure, also allows a little bit of that flex that creates that spring back. As it flexes through the axe arc, it flexes into that dead air in the large pores, and then it springs back at the end. When you've got a smaller pored wood like red ash, you're not going to have as much room to flex into, and therefore end up with a slightly more brittle handle. And that's why I would say red ash, while it might be fine, because again, like how heavy is this hammer? Geno hammers can be used for a variety of things, from teeny little like plain hammers, in which case any old species is going to work because you should just be tapping it. But if you're using it as a carpenter hammer, you're going to want something that you can swing through an arc. And hickory is still going to be the winner there. When I go into tropicals and we look at greenheart, or we look at eBay, because I know those numbers off the top of my head because we sell hundreds of thousands of linear feet a month of that stuff, sometimes a week. Yeah, those numbers are higher. But the distinction I made earlier with hickory is Ipe is a diffuse porous wood with teeny, tiny little pores, massive density. There is zero room to move. So what you have, where you have hickory with a little bit of room to move and high strength, you got Ipe with high strength with no room to move. That translates to brittle, very brash. And the impact resistance, while it's great for a deck, unless you have regular herds of elephants in high-heeled shoes running across your deck, it's fine, because for the most part, that's a static load. The stiffness and 16 inches on center is not tested, really. And, code for decks is 16 inches on center. If you try to use that for a hammer, first of all, the handle might weigh more than the head. Now your entire tool is out of balance. That's a key point with chisels, with hammers, etc. If you've got a tool that's out of balance, it's going to feel sluggish as you swing it. You want to use the handle as a vehicle for moving the head through space. And if the handle is heavy enough that it's interfering with moving the heavier or the same weight head, you're spilling energy in moving the handle. You want that handle, or the entire assembly, I should say, to be well balanced enough that the head wants to swing. Like if I'm holding this axe and I tip one way or the other, the head is going to draw it down. If I've got a particularly heavy handle, it's not going to want to tip one way or the other. It's not going to readily move that axe head or that hammer head through space. So be wary of those tropicals. A, they're going to be more brittle. B, they're just going to be heavier. And you're going to tire yourself out swinging that hammer, but you're also going to be spilling energy left and right. The brilliance in hickory is its high strength, but also it's relatively lightweight. I made a case earlier saying that it's heavy, 50 pounds per cubic foot. From a domestic perspective, that's heavy. But from an exotic perspective, that ain't heavy, folks. So this is that next level stuff. And when I teach about wood technical properties, I start with Janko hardness. I start with density. And then I get into like the level 2 stuff where I start talking about strength numbers, stiffness, and bending. But ultimately, I always end every lecture about this by saying you need to look at all of those together. Look at kind of each individual one to kind of narrow your list down, but then look at them together. How does that structure, that ring porous nature, that pore size, how does that affect things like density? How does that affect bending strength and stiffness? When I apply this wood to however I'm going to use it, in this case, a hammer handle, what forces are acting on that wood as I'm using that hammer? And what does pore structure, what does density, what does MOR, what does MOE have to do with that? That's applying those numbers into an application. And that, my friends, is next level wood science. So I sincerely appreciate, and this is not the first one of these emails that I've gotten I've gotten a couple emails from Kyle as we've walked through this, but I've gotten other people who've said, hey, I applied what you learned and this is what I found. I love seeing this, folks. This is what empowers us to know how any wood is going to work. If you can understand those technical properties and apply them to what you're trying to build, what you're trying to do, that's when you become a wood master. So with that being said, hey, thanks for listening to the show. Thanks for coming by and geeking out on wood with me. Every single time I hear from one of you that say, I love the geekiness of your show, it just makes me smile because most people just roll their eyes at me all the time. So thank you guys for listening. Go buy some wood. Go buy some hickory. Put it in your house and you might get a tax credit for it.